The whole of Greywater Hall had gone silent, and Verena could hear her own bond ring being taken from her. Not physically taken. No one touched her. But she felt it leave her all the same. That thin silver band on her fourth finger that had bound her to Torin Duskmere for 3 winters, warming whenever he was near, cooling when he rode too far. She felt the warmth drain out of it now, as if the metal itself had understood before she had. Above them, on the raised stone dais, where the Alpha King spoke the choosing every equinox, Torin had just named his Luna before the entire pack. And it had not been her. 400 wolves stood packed, shoulder to shoulder beneath the vaulted rafters, and not one of them was breathing. The old banners hung motionless. The braziers along the walls had stopped their crackling, or perhaps she'd simply stopped being able to hear them over the roaring in her ears. Verena stood in the front rank, exactly where the Luna was meant to stand, in the pale gray ceremonial gown she had spent the whole morning being sewn into, and she watched a woman she had met exactly twice climb the dais steps and take the place that had been hers. Odette Ravenscar, beautiful in the sharp, deliberate way of the border houses, her dark hair braided with river pearls, her chin lifted like she'd expected this all along. She did not look at Verena. That somehow was the cruelest part. She simply turned to face the pack as though the position had been empty, as though there had never been anyone standing in it. Say something, Verena told herself. Anything. Make him look at you. But Torin would not look at her. He stood at the center of the dais in the black and silver of the Duskmere line, taller than any wolf in the hall, broad across the shoulders in a way that had once made her feel safe and now made him feel like a wall she was being pressed against. The Alpha King who had held the northern passes against 3 invading packs, the Alpha King who had once, in the dark of their chambers, admitted he'd been afraid of only one thing in his life, and would not tell her what. His jaw was set. His gray eyes were fixed on nothing at all, on the empty air just above every head in the room, and they did not move. They did not once flick toward the woman he had bonded, wed, and called his own for 3 years. That refusal was its own answer. She understood it the way you understand a wound, not the pain, first, but the wrongness, the this should not be, arriving a full second before it began to hurt. Somewhere behind her, a pup began to cry, and was hushed. An old woman near the wall made the moon sign over her own heart, the gesture wolves used at a graveside. And still the hall did not breathe, because a choosing was the oldest and most binding rite the Duskmere kept, older than the stone the hall was built on, and every soul beneath that roof understood that they had just watched their king unmake 3 years of his own life without so much as a tremor in his voice. They were waiting to see what the discarded Luna would do. She could feel the weight of that waiting, like a hand pressing between her shoulder blades. In the reach of Valemore, a passed-over mate was a thing of shame. Not the one who did the passing, never him, but the one left standing in the empty place, as though being unwanted were a crime the unwanted had committed against everyone forced to witness it. Verena had lived her whole life, half a step from exactly this. She had simply never expected to arrive at it from so high up, or to fall so far, or to have it done to her by the one person who had ever told her she would never have to fall again. Verena became aware that she was still standing. That her legs had not given out, though they wanted to. That her hands, folded at her waist, had begun to tremble, and that 400 pairs of eyes had slid, one by one, off the dais, and onto her, the passed-over Luna, the foundling girl who had climbed too high, standing in a gown the color of ash, while another woman was crowned above her. She saw the pity in some of them, the satisfaction in others. She had always known which faces held which. She could have run. That was what they expected. That was what the ash-gray girl from a nothing pack would do. Flee, weeping into the dark, and let them tell the story however they liked. Instead, Verena reached up and slid the ring from her finger. It came away easily. Too easily, for something that had been warm against her skin every day for 3 years. She held it in her open palm for a moment, this small, cold circle that had meant chosen, that had meant his, that had meant she was not a mistake, the world would eventually correct. Then she climbed the 3 steps of the dais herself. The whole hall inhaled. She did not go to Odette. She went to Torin, and she stopped close enough to see the pulse jump in his throat, close enough that his gaze finally, dropped from the middle distance and met hers. And for one instant something moved behind his eyes that she would spend a long time afterward trying to name. It was not triumph, it was not indifference. It looked, impossibly, like a man watching the last light go out of a room he could not enter. She took his hand, she turned it palm up. She set the ring in the center of it and closed his fingers over it, and she felt him flinch as though she'd pressed a coal into his skin. Then it was never mine to keep, Verena said quietly. Only for him. She turned and walked back down the steps, through the silent hall, past 400 wolves who parted for her without being asked, past Bram, the king's beta, Torin's second and oldest friend, whose stricken face she could not afford to look at, and out through the great doors of Greywater Hall into the cold blue evening. She did not look back. She had spent 3 years learning how not to look back. But she felt it the moment she crossed the threshold. A tearing deep behind her breastbone, as though a thread that ran through the very center of her had been drawn tight and begun, slowly, to fray. She pressed her hand flat against her chest and kept walking. Down the long stone path, toward the outer gates, toward the dark tree line beyond, and told herself it was only grief. She was almost to the gates when she saw the mark on her wrist. The bond mark, the thin silver crescent, that had appeared there the night Torin claimed her, that every mated wolf carried, that was supposed to fade only in death. In the blue dusk, it should have gleamed like a sliver of moon. It had gone the color of ash, and as she watched, a hairline crack opened across it, dark as a burn, and began, very slowly, to spread. To understand how Verena came to stand in that hall in a gray gown, you have to understand that she was never supposed to have stood anywhere at all. She had been found, not born, found, on the floodstones of the Fenlo Crossing during the worst spring melt in living memory. A squalling infant, wrapped in a fisherman's coat, with no pack scent on her that anyone could name. The Fenlo was the smallest, poorest pack in the whole reach of Vielmore, a scatter of eelfishers and reed cutters, who could barely feed their own, and they had very nearly left her on the stones. That she had lived at all was a kind of accident. She had spent her whole childhood aware of it, that she was the mouth no one had chosen to feed, the girl who slept in the healer's back room because no family had a bed to spare, the one who learned early to make herself useful precisely because usefulness was the only rent she could pay on a life she'd been loaned rather than given. She had learned herbs from old Marta, the Fenlo's healer. She had learned to read weather in the reeds, to set a bone, to keep her voice soft and her needs small. She had learned to be the first to rise and the last to eat, to notice what a room needed before the room noticed her, to earn a place at every table by being too useful to send away from it. And she had learned most of all the great governing rule of her existence, that nothing was hers by right. Everything she had been allowed, and what is allowed can be taken back. It was not bitterness. She had never been able to afford bitterness. Bitterness was a luxury for people who believed they were owed something. It was simply the shape the world had pressed her into, so early and so completely, that she had stopped feeling the edges of it, the way you stop feeling a scar you've carried since childhood. She was the girl who was grateful. She was the girl who did not take up room. And she had believed, right up until this evening, that she had left that girl behind on the floodstones of the Fenlo. Which was why, when the Alpha King of the Duskmere had ridden through the Fenlo 4 years ago on his way to the Northern Muster, and had stopped, because a slight green-eyed girl on the riverbank had, without knowing who he was, told him bluntly that his warhorse was going lame in the off-fore and he was a fool to ride it another mile. Verena had assumed the whole encounter would evaporate the moment he left. It hadn't. He'd come back. Not the next day, or the next, but a season later, and then again inventing reasons that fooled no one, until the reasons stopped being necessary. She still did not fully understand what he had seen in her. She was not a border lord's daughter, with pearls in her hair. She had no lands, no line, no dowry, but a satchel of dried herbs, and a way of speaking the truth that most people found alarming. But Taran Duskmere, who could have chosen from any of the great houses, who should have, for the alliances a king's match was meant to buy, had chosen her. Chosen, the word had undone her. She had not known, until she had it, how starved she'd been for it, her entire life. The bonding had scandalized half of Vilemore. A foundling Luna, a girl with no bloodline, seated at the Alpha King's right hand. The border houses had never forgiven it, and Verena had felt their disapproval like a draft under a door for 3 years. But Torin had never once let her stand in it alone. That was the thing she kept returning to. Now walking the dark road away from Greywater, with her cracked wrist pressed to her chest, he never let me stand in it alone. When the whispers had followed her through the corridors, his hand had found the small of her back. When Lord Ravenscar had implied at a feast that the king had bonded beneath himself, Torin had gone so still and so cold that the whole table had remembered, all at once, exactly what he was. 3 years. 3 years of a warmth she had never believed she'd be permitted to keep, and she had been right not to believe it. That was the poison of the day, curling through her as she walked. Not only that he had chosen another, but that some small, ancient, ash-gray part of her had always known he would. Had been waiting the whole time for the loan to be called in. Everything I have been allowed. And what is allowed can be taken back. She had reached the tree line now. The lanterns of Greywater Hall were far behind her, small and gold, and no longer hers. The bond mark on her wrist throbbed with each step, a deep ache spreading up her arm and into her chest, and she was beginning to understand that this was not ordinary grief. She had attended enough mated wolves through the death of a partner to know what a breaking bond felt like from the outside. She had never felt one from the inside. She had not known it would feel like this, like something with roots was being pulled out of her a fiber at a time. She stopped, leaned against a black pine, made herself breathe. He looked at me. At the very end, he had looked at her, and his face had not been the face of a man discarding a burden. She turned the memory over, the way she'd been taught to turn over a symptom that didn't fit the diagnosis. The border houses had wanted Odette Ravenscar as Luna for years. That was no secret. The Ravenscar pack held the eastern salt roads and half the Reach's grain, and an alliance with them was worth more than any king's affection. Any king, seeking advantage, would have chosen Odette from the start. But Torin had not chosen her from the start. He had chosen a foundling, at ruinous political cost, and held to her for 3 years against the pressure of every great house in Vilemore, and then with no warning, on an ordinary equinox, in front of his entire pack, he had reversed it. Men did not reverse the great decisions of their lives on an ordinary day for no reason. Something had happened, something recent, something she had not been told. The thought steadied her more than grief had, because grief only wanted her to lie down in the dark, and this new thing wanted her to know. She had spent her whole life being the person things happened to. For once, standing under a black pine, with her bond turning to ash on her wrist, she felt the first cold flicker of a different impulse entirely. She heard the hoofbeats before she saw the rider. Fast, coming down the dark road from the hall, a single horse ridden hard. Verena stepped back into the shadow of the pine, her heart slamming. If Torin had sent guards to see the discarded Luna off his lands, she did not think she could bear it. If he had sent them for something worse. The rider reined in at the tree line, close, breathing hard, and pushed back his hood. It was Bram, Verena. The beta's voice was low, and urgent, and utterly wrong. Bram, who was never anything but easy, who joked at council until Torin threatened to have him thrown in the river, was looking at her the way you look at someone standing at the edge of a cliff. Thank the moon, I thought. He stopped. His gaze dropped to her wrist, to the cracked gray crescent, and every remaining trace of color left his face. How bad? He asked. You knew, Verena breathed. You knew he was going to do it. Verena, listen to me. You cannot leave Valemore. Bram swung down from the horse hands raised, as though gentling a spooked animal. I know how that sounds. I know what he did to you in there, and I swear to you, it is not what you think it is. But you have to trust me on this. One thing, if you cross the border with that bond, half severed, you will not survive the week. Verena went very still. What did you say? Bram looked back over his shoulder toward the distant gold lanterns of the hall, as if he could already hear someone coming, and when he turned back to her, his voice had dropped to almost nothing. He didn't choose Odette, Bram said. He bought you a little more time, and he's going to hate himself for it either way. Please come back inside before the crack reaches your heart. Verena did not go back inside. She wanted to. Some traitor part of her wanted. Nothing more than to let Bram lead her back through those doors, back toward the warmth she'd walked out of. But 3 years of standing in the border house's disapproval had taught her something about doorways. That once you let someone watch you walk back through one you've made a point of leaving, you hand them the story forever. And she had just, in front of 400 wolves, made a very great point of leaving. No, she said. I'm not going back into that hall, but I'm not crossing the border either. Not yet. Tell me what you meant, Bram. Bram's jaw worked. He was caught, she could see, between an urgency that wanted her safe behind walls and something else. Some vow, some order that had sealed his mouth. In the end, the urgency won only halfway. Not here, he said. There's a keeper's cottage on the old orchard road, empty since autumn. You'll be inside Duskmere land, so the bond won't tear the way it would past the border, but you'll be off the hall grounds. Away from, he hesitated, from her people. Stay there tonight. I'll come at first light and tell you what I can, which is more than I should and less than you deserve. He pressed something into her hand, a heavy iron key, still warm from his fist. Swear to me you'll be there, not the border, swear it. The ache in her wrist had spread to her elbow now. She was in no condition to argue, and she knew it. I swear, she said. He remounted, then paused, looking down at her with an expression she would think about for a long time afterward, grief, and guilt, and something almost like hope, all tangled together. For what it's worth, Bram said, when you put that ring in his hand and told him it was never yours to keep, you have no idea what that did to him. You think you humiliated yourself in there tonight. He shook his head slowly. You didn't. You're the only one who walked out of that hall with everything still intact. Then he was gone, hoofbeats fading into the dark, and Verena was alone on the orchard road, with an iron key and a bond turning to ash. The keeper's cottage was small and cold, and smelled of apples long since carried away, and Verena had never in her life been more grateful for 4 walls and a door she could bar. She got a fire going, with hands that shook from cold, from the bond, from the slow cresting understanding of everything the night had been. She wrapped herself in a dust sheet, pulled off the single bed, and she sat before the little hearth and made herself examine her wrist in the firelight the way she would examine a patient, because being a healer was the one solid thing she had left to stand on. The crescent had gone, the gray of cold ash. The crack that split it had widened and sent finer cracks branching off it, and along those cracks the skin had begun to darken, not like a bruise, but like the edge of scorched paper. When she pressed the mark, cold radiated out from it, not the numb cold of a dead limb, but an actively spreading cold, as though winter were leaking into her from that one small point and working outward toward her heart. If you cross the border with that bond half severed, you will not survive the week. She was not certain she would survive the week regardless. She had never heard of a breaking bond that behaved like this. When a mate died, the surviving wolf grieved, sometimes terribly, sometimes fatally, but the mark simply faded, gently, over a season, like a scar going white. It did not crack, it did not spread cold, like a poison with an appetite. Whatever was happening to her was not the clean severance of a bond ended by choice or death. It was something being done to the bond, something deliberate. She had spent 3 years, being told, in 100 small ways, that she did not truly belong at the Alpha King's side, and so the simplest story, the one the border houses would tell by tomorrow, was the easiest to believe, that the king had come to his senses, set the foundling aside, and taken a proper Luna, and that the girl's own body was now failing from the shame of it. It was a tidy story. It required no villain and no mystery. It asked her to believe only the one thing she had always been most ready to believe, that she had never been enough. And that, precisely, was why she distrusted it. Verena had learned as a healer that the diagnosis a frightened patient reaches for first is almost never the true one. It is only the one they already feared. The cold in her wrist was not shame. Shame did not crack silver like ice cracks a pond. Something with intent was unmaking her, thread by thread, and intent meant a hand, and a hand meant a reason. He bought you a little more time. Bought it from whom? And with what, if not with her? Exhaustion took her before she found an answer. She had not meant to sleep. She'd meant to keep the fire fed and her mind working, but the day had hollowed her out, and between one blink and the next, the little hearth was gone. She was standing in a wood she had never seen, and knew at once she was meant to know. It was a grove of tall, pale trees, silver-barked, their canopy so high and so dense it made a second sky overhead, and through it a great full moon poured light down in long, soft columns. In the center of the grove stood one tree, greater than all the rest, vast, ancient, its bark the bright polished silver of a coin, its leaves catching the moonlight, and throwing it back so that the whole clearing swam in a gentle silver glow. The air was warm and still and smelled of moss and cold water and something green and living. Somewhere she could hear a spring, the Silverwood, she thought, though no one had ever told her the name. She simply knew it, the way you know your own name in a dream. This was the heart of the bond. This was the place two mated souls were said to meet in sleep. Though she and Torin never had, she'd assumed the stories were only stories. Then she saw that the great silver tree was dying. It began at the roots. A blackness was creeping up the bright bark from the ground. Not fire, not rot, but a spreading dark that turned the silver to the same scorched ash gray as the mark on her wrist, and where the darkness climbed, the leaves above curled and blackened and fell drifting down through the moonlit columns like flakes of soot. As she watched, frost bloomed across a whole silver bough, and it cracked with a sound like a breaking bone, and the warmth went out of the air. "No," Verena whispered, and ran to the tree, and pressed both hands flat against the cold bark, as if she could hold the light in it by will alone. Under her palms, she could feel it, a faint, failing pulse, growing weaker, the heartbeat of something enormous and old and loved, going out. "No, no, stay. You shouldn't be here." She spun. Torin stood at the edge of the clearing in the blackened silver he'd worn in the hall, and his face in the moonlight was not the closed wall. It had been on the dais. It was open, and it was devastated, and he was staring at her hands on the tree, as though she'd reached into his own chest. "You shouldn't be here," he said again, and there was raw fear in it. "How are you here? You gave it back. You gave the ring back. The bond should be. You should be free of me. You should be safe." "Torin, the tree," Verena's voice cracked. "The tree is dying. The bond. What's happening to it? What did you do?" He crossed the clearing in 3 strides, and for one wild moment, she thought he would take her in his arms. He stopped just short. His hands hovered at her shoulders, trembling, not touching, exactly as Bram's had gentled the air. "Listen to me," he said, low and fast. "Whatever they tell you, whatever he tells you, you have to keep away from the Raven Scar. You have to keep away from me most of all. If the bond finishes breaking clean, you live. Do you understand? If it breaks clean, you live. And I can bear anything as long as the blackness at the roots surged upward with a sound like tearing cloth. The whole grove shuddered. Frost raced across the ground toward them, and where it touched Verena's bare feet, the cold bit down to the bone, and she gasped, and woke, gasping, on the floor of the keeper's cottage. The fire burned to embers, gray dawn light in the window, and both her hands stretched out in front of her, pressed flat against nothing at all. Her wrist was screaming. She looked down. The crack in the ash-gray crescent had reached the base of her palm, and a second crack had opened at the other end and begun to climb toward her forearm, toward her heart. And pinned beneath the cottage door, where someone had slid it through in the dark while she slept, was a single sheet of folded parchment, sealed with black wax, stamped with a raven. She knew the seal. Everyone in Vilemore knew the seal. The raven in flight over crossed salt roads was the crest of House Ravenscar, and it did not appear on parchment, slid under the doors of discarded foundlings for any friendly reason. Verena rose stiffly from the cold floor, cradling her wrist, and stood looking at the letter for a long moment before she picked it up. The wax was still faintly soft. Whoever had left it had done so recently, within the hour perhaps, moving through the gray pre-dawn to a cottage that was supposed to be empty, that only Bram was supposed to know she was in. That thought landed like ice water. Only Bram knew. She broke the seal. The hand inside was elegant, unhurried, the writing of someone who had never in their life needed to rush. Lady Verena, it read, and the lady was its own small cruelty, a courtesy she no longer had any right to. You will by now be feeling the cold in your wrist. Do not waste what little strength remains to you fighting it. The mark does only what it was always going to do. I write not to gloat, which would be beneath us both, but to offer you a kindness that no one else in this reach will trouble to offer. The king did not set you aside from cruelty, nor from any failing of yours. He set you aside because he was made to understand quite thoroughly what the alternative would cost. You are even now being permitted to leave with your life. That permission has an expiry. Come to the salt house on the eastern road before the moon is full, and I will tell you what he could not, and show you how the cold in your wrist may be stilled rather than allowed to reach your heart. Come alone. Tell no one, least of all the Beta, whose loyalties in this matter are not what you believe them to be. A friend, of sorts. There was no signature. There did not need to be. Verena read it 3 times. Then she set it down on the cold hearthstone with a steadiness that surprised her, and she thought she was a healer. She had been lied to by patients her entire life. The man who swore he hadn't been drinking, the mother who insisted the child's cough was nothing, the guardsman who claimed the wound was 3 days old when the smell said otherwise. She had learned that the most useful thing about a lie was not that it was false, but that people only ever troubled to lie about the things that mattered. And this letter was a very great deal of trouble to have taken over a foundling girl, who was, by its own account, already as good as dead, least of all the Beta, whose loyalties in this matter are not what you believe them to be. That was the line meant to do the work. That was the hook. Turn her against the one person who'd ridden into the dark to warn her, isolate her, come alone, tell no one, and steer her, cold and frightened and grieving, to a salt house on an empty road. She had been raised among people who had every reason to be rid of her. She knew the shape of a trap laid for someone the world would not miss. And yet, I will tell you what he could not. There it was again, the second time in one night that someone had told her Torin had been prevented, constrained, made to understand what the alternative would cost. Bram had said it. Torin himself had said it, in the grove, half mad with fear. Whatever they tell you, whatever he tells you. 2 people who despised each other, agreeing on the single most important fact of her life. Her husband had not stopped wanting her. Her husband had been made to give her up, and the making of it had involved the cold that was, at this moment, cracking its way up her arm toward her heart. Someone had a leash on the Alpha King of the Duskmere. And whatever that leash was, it ran straight through her. She sat back on her heels, and made herself think it through the way she'd think through a poisoning, because that, she was increasingly certain, was what this was. Start with what the poison wants. A poison that killed outright would have killed her in the hall. Instead, this one lingered, crawled, gave her days rather than moments, which meant her death was not the aim, or not the only aim. The letter all but said so. You are being permitted to leave with your life. The cold may be stilled rather than allowed to reach your heart. Someone wanted her alive, but leashed, exactly, as they'd leashed Torin. Someone wanted her frightened and grateful and steerable, riding alone to a salt house on an empty road, because the alternative was a slow, freezing death. Grateful. There was that word again, the one that had shaped her whole life. Whoever had written this letter understood her better than she liked. They had built the whole thing around the assumption that a foundling faced with dying would do what foundlings did. Take the scrap of kindness offered by the stronger hand, ask no questions, be no trouble, be useful to whatever purpose that hand intended. It was, she thought, with a flicker of something that was almost anger, a very well-aimed trap. It had simply been aimed at the girl she used to be. She looked down at her wrist. In the strengthening dawn, the darkness along the cracks had deepened from scorched brown to true black, and the cold had climbed past her elbow now. She could feel it as a line, an advancing tide mark, and above that line, her arm was hers, and below it her arm belonged to the winter that was eating her. She flexed her fingers. They answered slowly, as though from a long way off. She did not need to be a healer to read the arithmetic of it. The cold had crossed the distance from her wrist to her elbow in a single night. Her elbow to her heart was not much farther. She had days, as the letter said, perhaps fewer than it wanted her to think. Which was the trap's one flaw? A trap that must be sprung before its victim dies is a trap on a clock, and a clock cuts both ways. Whoever held the other end of Torin's leash needed her to come to the salt house soon, needed it badly enough to risk a letter, to bribe or follow their way to a cottage only Bram knew. They were not comfortable. They were hurrying. And people who hurried made the mistakes that people who could afford to wait never did. She would not go to the salt house. But she would find out who had told her not to trust Bram, and why they had needed to. Because you only trouble to sever a rope you're afraid is holding a fist hammered on the cottage door. Verina's heart lurched into her throat. She snatched up the fire iron from the hearth, a poor weapon, but her hands closed around it before she'd decided to, and pressed herself to the wall beside the door. Verina. Bram's voice, low, ragged, and unmistakably frightened. Verina, open the door please, we don't have time. She didn't open it. You said first light, she said through the wood. It's barely gray. I know what I said. A pause, and when he spoke again the words came fast, tumbling over one another. Odette's people rode out from the hall an hour ago, 6 of them, armed, on the orchard road. I don't know how they know where you are. No one knows you're here, Verina. No one but me, but they're coming, and if they reach you, before I get you off this land, I can't protect you. I can't even. His voice broke. Please. Open the door. Verina did not move from the wall. Her mind was working very fast and very cold, the way it did over a patient who was failing in front of her, when panic was a thing she could not yet afford. Everything Bram said might be true. The riders might be real. His fear certainly sounded real. And Bram had never in the years she'd known him been able to feign a feeling. It was half the reason Torin trusted him, and half the reason the council didn't. If she barred this door against him and the Ravenscar riders truly were coming, she would die in this cottage of her own suspicion, and Bram with her. But, how many people knew where you were sending me tonight? She asked through the door, keeping her voice level. 1. Me. That's the whole point, Verina. I gave you a place. No one. Then explain the letter. Silence on the other side of the wood. Into it she said, someone slid a sealed letter under this door before dawn. House Ravenscar's seal. It knew about the cold in my wrist. It knew exactly which cottage I was in. This cottage. The one only you knew about. And it went to a great deal of trouble to tell me one thing above all others. She heard her own pulse in her ears. It told me not to trust you. The silence stretched so long, she thought he might have gone. Show it to me, Bram said at last, and his voice had changed. The raw urgency was still there, but under it now was something flat and careful and afraid in a wholly different way. Verina, slide it under the door, please. If that seal is what you say it is, then they've had eyes on me since last night. And that means the 6 riders aren't the danger. The danger is already inside the hall, and it's been inside it a lot longer than tonight. A breath. And it means the one thing I was ordered never to tell you is the only thing that might keep you alive. Verena looked down at the parchment on the hearthstone, black raven seal gleaming faintly in the dawn. No one knows you're here, Verena. No one but me. But someone had slid a letter under this door in the dark. Someone had known exactly where the beta had hidden her. The one place, the only place, that only Bram was supposed to know. She looked at the door. She looked at the fire iron in her white-knuckled hand. And for the first time since she had climbed those dais steps and pressed a cold ring into a warm palm, Verena did not know whose voice on the other side of a door she could afford to believe. Bram, she said slowly, not lowering the iron. How did you know which cottage to send me to? For a long moment, there was nothing but the crackle of the dying fire and the cold advancing up her arm. Then Bram answered, and he did not answer the way a guilty man answers. Because it's mine, he said through the door. The cottage. My grandfather was the orchard keeper here. I was whelped in that back room you slept in. It isn't on any ledger of the halls. It's held in my mother's name. And in 11 years, I have told exactly no one it exists. That's why I sent you there, Verena. Because it was the one place in all of Valemore that belonged to me, and to no one at the hall. A pause, and his voice dropped. Which means if a Ravenscar letter found it before dawn, then they are not guessing, and they did not follow you. They followed me. They have been reading me like a book, and I never felt the eyes. Do you understand what that costs me to say? She did. Bram's whole worth to Torin was that he saw what others missed. For him to admit he'd been watched without knowing it was for him to hand her the knife and bare his own throat. Verena unbarred the door. Bram looked 10 years older than he had in the hall. He took in the fire iron, still in her fist, without flinching. Took in her wrist, the black cracks reaching now past her elbow, and his face did something complicated and awful. He did not try to embrace her. He crouched, picked up the raven-sealed letter she'd slid across the floor toward him, and read it once fast, his jaw tightening, line by line. A friend, of sorts, he read aloud, and laughed without any humor in it. She always did enjoy her own manners. He looked up. This is Sabine Ravenscar's hand, Odette's grandmother. Odette is the face they put in the hall because a face is what a choosing needs, but the hand on the reins has always been the old woman's. Bram. Verena's voice came out steadier than she felt. What is she? Because that, she lifted her cracked wrist between them, is not grief. And it is not any breaking bond I have ever tended. Something is doing this to me, on purpose. Slowly the Ravenscar are thread weavers. He said it flatly, the way you say a thing you've been forbidden to say, and have decided to say anyway. Not fighters. Not really. They don't take a pack by the throat. They take it by the threads, the bonds. Every wolf is tied to the ones they love and the pack they belong to by threads you can't see, and the Ravenscar line can see them, find them, hold them. His eyes went to her wrist, and cut them, slowly if they choose. A severing, done with craft, doesn't snap. It unravels, and for a bond as deep as yours and Torin's, an unraveling doesn't end in grief. He didn't finish. He didn't have to. That's not possible, Verena said, though even as she said it, she could feel that could feel the cold moving with an intelligence no illness had, seeking, patient, unhurried. Bonds aren't rope. You can't just take a knife to. You can, if you were born to the craft, and if the debt to do it was handed to you freely. Bram's voice was grim. That's the part that matters, Verena. Threadcraft this deep can't be forced on an unwilling wolf from the outside. It needs a door, a debt owed, a promise made. Something that gives the weaver leave to touch the thread in the first place. He looked at her steadily. Someone opened that door for her. Someone gave Sabine Ravenscar leave to lay hands on your bond. And there is exactly one person in all the world with the standing to open the door to your bond with the king. Verena sat down slowly on the edge of the dusty bed. Pieces she'd been turning over all night were sliding into their places, and she did not like the picture they made. He knew, she said. Torin. He knew what she is, what she can do. That's why he did it. That's what Bram meant. He bought me time. Sabine came to him a fortnight ago, Bram said quietly. Told him she was calling in an old debt, one he'd owed her since before he ever laid eyes on you. The terms were simple. Set you aside by the old right, before the whole pack, and take Odette as Luna, or she'd unravel your thread where you stood and let him watch you die of it in the hall. He believed that if he did what she asked, the debt would be paid and you'd be spared, cast off, heartbroken, exiled, hating him, but alive. Bram's mouth twisted. He chose the version where you got to keep breathing and got to hate him for it. He thought that was the kindest door left to him. He walked through it in front of 400 people and never let his face move, because he thought your life was on the other side of it. Verena pressed the heel of her hand against her sternum, where a deeper, colder ache had begun, faint, but new, and lower than her arm. Then it isn't working, she said, whatever bargain he thought he made. He gave her everything she asked for. He set me aside, he married her line, and she's still unraveling me. She met the beta's eyes. She was never going to spare me, was she? Bram went very still. No, he said, I don't think she was. Which means he broke both our hearts in front of the whole pack, Verena said, and her voice did not shake, though everything in her wanted it to, for nothing. The cold surged, a hard, bright pulse of it, and she gasped and folded forward. Bram was at her side in an instant, one hand hovering at her shoulder, and where his hand came near her wrist, she felt, faintly, briefly, the cold ease, a hair's breadth, a held breath of relief. Then he shifted back, and it returned. They both felt it. Bram's eyes widened. Pack thread, he breathed. You're still bound to the Duskmere through me, through all of us. The pack bond, not the mate bond. Near your own pack, on your own ground, near the ones tied to you, the unraveling slows. It can't feed as fast. He gripped her shoulder deliberately now, and again the cold pulled back a fraction, and Verena understood with a lurch what he was going to say before he said it. But the pack thread is a stream, Verena. The mate thread is the river. If the pack bond slows it this much, he stopped, you need to be near him, not the pack. Him. The one thread strong enough to hold the winter back is the exact one she's cutting. You want me to go to the man who threw me away in front of everyone I know, Verena said. I want you to live, said Bram, and I think, God's help us both, those turn out to be the same errand. She almost laughed. It was so exactly the shape of her whole life, that survival and swallowing her pride had never once, not one single time, been allowed to be different things. Then take me to him, she said, and rose on legs that only shook a little. Where is he? Back at the hall, playing husband to Odette Ravenscar, while I freeze on his orchard road. Bram's face closed like a door. No, he said. That's the other thing I wrote out to tell you, before the letter changed everything. He drew a breath, when Torin realized the unraveling hadn't stopped. That you were still being cut, even after he'd paid Sabine's price. He understood what you just understood. That she played him, that your life was never on the table. Bram's voice dropped to almost nothing, so he took the one piece off the board he still controls. He rode for Corvath an hour ago, for the Ravenscar seat. Alone, he means to offer Sabine the only thread she might take instead of yours. Verena's blood went colder than her arm. His own, she whispered. His own, said Bram. He's going to let her unravel him, Verena, and he thinks it's a bargain, because in his head, a world with you, alive and him gone, has always been the better world. He has believed that about himself since long before he ever met you. He was already moving for the door, already reaching for her. The horse can carry two. If we ride now, we can reach the eastern road before he reaches Corvath. But I have to tell you, if he sees you coming, he won't stop. He'll ride faster. In his mind, you arriving is the one thing that makes his death pointless. For a heartbeat, Verena did not move, and in that heartbeat, something in her that had been bent low, her whole life stood slowly up. because she saw it now, saw the whole shape of it laid out plain, in man riding alone to his death to spare her, and telling no one and asking no one, exactly the way she had spent 30 years, asking no one for anything. He thought he was being kind. He thought his dying was a gift he could hand her, the last and largest of the small self-erasures he'd built a life out of. And it was the cruelest thing anyone had ever tried to do to her, dressed up as love, and she recognized it instantly, because it was cut from the very same cloth as her own endless, "I'm no trouble, I don't need anything." Two people who did not know how to be loved, both of them trying to disappear, each convinced the disappearing was for the other's sake. She was done disappearing. She had a lifetime of practice at it, and not 1 hour of it had ever made her safe. Verena was already pulling her cloak from the peg. "Then we better reach him," she said, "before he has time to be noble." They caught him at the crossing where the eastern road forded the Salt Creek, in the thin gray light of a morning that could not decide whether to be day. The ride there was the longest of Verena's life. Bram drove the horse harder than any beast should be driven, and she clung to him with her good arm and pressed her failing one to her chest and counted the colds advance the way she'd once counted the seconds in that silent hall, not to her wrist now, not to her elbow, but lower. Verena would remember it in pieces for the rest of her life. The horse blown and lathered beneath them, Bram's arm barred across her as he reined in so hard the animal skidded on the wet stone. And Torin, dismounted, standing at the center of the old stone ford, with his back to them and his head bowed, so terribly still, like a man who had already finished the argument with himself, and lost. His own horse stood riderless a little way off, reins looped over a leaning post, as though he had meant to walk the last of the road to Corvath on foot, the way a man walks to a thing he does not intend to walk back from. Beyond him, low against the eastern hills, she could see the black towers of the Ravenscar seat, close enough now to make out the ravens wheeling above them, and she understood that they had reached him with almost nothing to spare. "Torin!" Brom's shout cracked across the water. He turned, and for one instant before he understood, before the shape of her registered, his face opened with a raw, involuntary hope, so naked it hurt to see. Then it closed, and something in his expression died, exactly as Bram had promised it would. "No," Torin said. No, you can't be here. Bram, what have you done? You were meant to get her out." Verena slid down from the horse, before it had fully stopped, and walked toward him across the ford, and the cold water soaked her hem, and she did not feel it, because there was a colder thing in her chest and a hotter thing behind her ribs, and both of them were his fault. "You decided," she said. Her voice carried flat and hard across the water. "You decided in a hall full of people that my life was worth more than the truth. You decided I'd be better off hating you than knowing you. And now you've ridden out to decide, all by yourself, that the world is better with you dead in it. You have decided every single thing about my life this past fortnight, Torin Duskmere, and you have not asked me one question. Because you'd have chosen wrong." It broke out of him, ragged, the king's control gone. "You'd have chosen me. You'd have stood in that hall and refused to let go, and she'd have unraveled you where you stood, and I would have had to watch." His voice failed. "I have watched enough people die because they were bound to me, Verena. I will not watch you. If the only way to keep you out of her reach is to make you leave, or to take myself off the board so there's nothing left to bargain with, then that is the price, and I will pay it gladly. And you do not get a vote." "There it is," Verena said softly, and stopped a pace from him. "You think loving you is what put me in danger. So the loving thing, the only loving thing you can imagine, is to take yourself away. You've done it your whole life, haven't you? Given people your absence, and called it a gift." He flinched as though she'd struck him. "I'm right," she said, and now her voice did shake, because she had spent her whole life on the other side of exactly this, and had never once had the words for it until now. "I know you're right, because I've spent 30 years being the girl no one chose, and I built my whole self around, never taking up room, never asking, never being a burden. And here you are, the most powerful wolf in Valemore. And underneath all of it, you're doing the same thing I am. Making yourself small, making yourself gone, deciding that the people you love are safer without you, so you never have to risk being the reason they're hurt. Tears stood in her eyes and she let them. We are the same, Torin. And I am so tired of both of us. He flinched as though she'd struck him. You don't understand what it is, he said low. To be the danger. To lie awake knowing that the ones who stand closest to you are the ones the world will reach for first, because you are the thing they can be used against. You think I threw you away? His voice cracked down the middle. I have spent every night for a fortnight learning your face by heart in the dark so I'd have it after. I set you aside so that somewhere in the world you'd be warm, and hating me, and alive. That was the whole of my ambition, Verena. Not the throne, not the pack, not Odette Ravenscar's grain roads. Just you, breathing, on the far side of a door I'd never be allowed to open again. And you never once thought to let me help you carry it, she said. Because carrying it alone is the only way you know how to love, just like being grateful for scraps, is the only way I know how to be loved. She took the last step to him. We could put it down, Torin, both of us. At the same time. That's all I've ever wanted, and never had the nerve to say. For a moment he just looked at her, undone, the black towers of Corvith at his back, and the grey light on the water, and she saw the truth of it land in him, saw him recognize himself in her, the two matched wounds fitting together like halves of a broken thing. His hand lifted, at last, toward her face. Then, the cold reached her heart. It was not gradual, it was a door, slamming shut. One moment, she was standing in the ford, making the truest speech of her life. The next, the winter that had been climbing her arm all night, arrived, all at once, in the center of her chest, and the world went white at the edges and her legs simply stopped being hers. She heard Bram shout her name, she heard the water rush up to meet her. She did not hit it. Torin caught her, crossed the space between them faster than a man his size should move, and had her against his chest before she fell, one arm under her, one hand pressed flat and desperate over the cracked mark that had reached her heart. And where he touched her, the cold screamed and recoiled, the way a fire hisses when you throw water on it, the whole unraveling thread flaring bright and hot and alive under his hand, fighting the winter back inch by inch. Verena dragged in a breath that didn't feel like drowning. Her sight cleared. She was looking up at his face, close, the way she hadn't been allowed to for a fortnight, and he was weeping, openly, this man who never let his face move. Stay, he was saying. Stay. Stay. I've got you. Stay. That's the first thing you've asked me, she managed, instead of decided. Something broke open in his face at that. Not grief this time, but a kind of terrified wonder, as though after a fortnight of certainty he had just been handed a thing he did not know how to hold. His hand pressed harder over her heart, and the thread flared brighter, and for one impossible moment, the winter in her chest was not advancing at all. It was retreating. She felt it give ground before the heat of him, felt her own breath come easier, and she understood, dizzily, that Bram had been right, that the one thread, strong enough to hold the cold back, was the exact one being cut, and that as long as Torin held her, the blade could not finish its work. A slow clap sounded from the far bank. They both turned. On the eastern side of the ford, where the road climbed toward Corvath spires, an old woman had come down to the water's edge on foot, unhurried, wrapped in raven gray, flanked by 6 riders. Verena knew them at once, for the 6 Bram had seen leave the hall before dawn. Not hunters sent to run her down at the cottage, as he'd feared, but the matriarch's own escort, riding ahead to attend their mistress here, at the ford where she had known all along the chase would end. She was small and straight-backed and entirely unremarkable, which was somehow the most frightening thing about her, and between her raised hands she held a taut, shining, invisible something that Verena could not quite see, but could suddenly, horribly feel. A thread, drawn tight, humming with the cold that was in her own chest. When the old woman's fingers moved, The cold moved. It was that simple and that obscene. A whole life held between two withered hands, like a bit of embroidery. "Well," said Sabine Ravenscar. "Both of you? And the little beta too. How efficient." "I did so hope I wouldn't have to send anyone in after her." She smiled at Torin, and it was almost kind. "You needn't have ridden all this way to offer me your thread, Alpha King." "It was very gallant, but I'm afraid I don't want yours." Her gaze slid to Verena and sharpened, and grew hungry. "I never did. Yours was only ever the price I named to get her out of your hall, out of your pack, out into the open where the pack thread couldn't shield her. A choosing before 400 witnesses. The old right. Unbreakable. The surest way in all the world to make a beloved Luna leave her own protection willingly." She drew her hands a fraction wider apart, and in Verena's chest, the cold bit down, and Torin's hand flared white, fighting it. And Verena bit back a scream. "Whatever she is," Torin snarled, "whatever you think you'll take it through me. You will have to unmake me first, and I am not a loose thread. Sabine, I am the alpha of the Duskmere, and I am holding on." "Yes," Sabine said, delighted, as though he'd finally understood the lesson. "You are. Do you know, that is the only part of this that surprised me. I expected the bond to be strong. I did not expect it to be strong enough to hold my blade at the edge of her heart, with nothing but your bare hand." Her eyes glittered. "Do you know what that means, Torin Duskmere? Do you know what she is? To make a thread like that? No. Of course you don't. Neither did she." The old woman's smile widened until it was something with teeth in it. "But I do. And I have waited a very long time to hold a thread like hers in my hands, so I think, rather than take it now, in the wet and the cold, with you clinging to it like a drowning man, I shall let you keep her a few days more. Let the two of you make the bond deeper still. Let it grow fat for me." She lowered her hands, and the cold in Verena's chest froze in place, neither advancing nor retreating, a blade left buried to the hilt. "Run, little Moon Warden. Run and hide and cling to your king. Everything you do to keep that thread alive only makes it worth more to me. I'll be along to collect when it's ripe." She turned, unhurried, and walked back up the road, toward the waiting spires, and her 6 riders closed around her, like a raven's wing folding, and left them there, in the gray water, with a frozen blade in Verena's heart. They ran west from the ford with the blade frozen in Verena's heart, and they did not stop until they reached Orla. You did not chase a threadweaver onto her own ground. You did not so much as linger within sight of Corvath's towers. So they turned their backs on the black spires and rode until the horses could not, and it was Bram who knew where to go, for Bram, it turned out, had not ridden out that dawn as blindly as it seemed. Before he'd ever come to the keeper's cottage, he had sent word to the one living soul who had studied the Ravenscar craft long enough to stand against it, Orla, the old bond-keeper of the Duskmere, who had tended the pack threads since before Torin was whelped, and who had warned a young king against the price of a Ravenscar bargain, and been overruled by a king too desperate to save his young to listen. Orla's refuge was a low stone house, half sunk into a hillside 2 valleys west, warded so old and so deep that the cold in Verena's chest eased the moment they crossed the threshold. Not gone, never gone now, but held, banked like a fire. The bond-keeper was ancient, small, sharp-eyed, with hands stained from a lifetime of the craft, and she made Verena sit by the fire and bare her wrist, and she studied the frozen crack for a long, long time before she spoke. "It is paused," Orla said at last, "but do not mistake that for mercy, and do not mistake it for my doing." She paused it. "Sabine, on purpose, at the very lip of your heart, because a severing halted at the edge is a bond that goes on deepening, and a deeper bond is a richer thing to steal. She has left the blade in you, like a stake left in ripening fruit." The old woman's mouth thinned. "Understand me, child. I cannot heal this. No one can heal a severing from the outside. A cut thread does not knit. What I can do is set a ward on the wound so that she cannot take the blade up again from a distance, the way she has been cutting you all night from the comfort of her tower. With my ward on you, she will have to come close to finish it. She will have to come to the one place your bond truly lives. Orla's eyes were grave. That buys you a little time. It does not buy you safety. It only chooses the ground. Then tell me how to stop it for good, Verena said. That, said Orla, is a question for him. And she looked at Torin. He was standing by the door where he'd stood since they arrived, as if he had not earned the right to come nearer the fire, and Verena thought that was the most Torin thing she had ever seen. He didn't sit even now. But he began at last to talk, and the whole shape of the last fortnight, of the last 4 years, of the man himself, turned over in the firelight, as he did. Before I was king a full year, he said, a fever came through the duskmare. The gray fever. It took the pups first. It always takes the pups first. His jaw worked. We lost 11 of our young in a single moon. My healers could do nothing. It wasn't a fever of the body, they said. It was a fever of the thread. The pack bond itself gone sick, and there was no craft in the duskmere that could mend a thread. And then a Ravenscar came to my door. Sabine, she said she could reweave the pack bond and stop the dying, and she could. She did. Not one child died after the night she worked. He closed his eyes. The price was a debt thread. A single claim, to be called at a time of her choosing, on a bond of her choosing. I was young, and I was burying children, and I would have promised her the son. He opened his eyes and looked at Verena, and the guilt in them was an ocean. I did not know, when I met you, that I was the most dangerous thing that could happen to you. I did not know that loving me made you a thread she could one day claim. By the time I understood what I'd done, that I'd painted a mark on you the day I'd bonded you, it was already done, and the only thing I could think to do with the knowledge was carry it alone and pray she never noticed you. But she noticed me, Verena said. She noticed what you are, said Orla quietly, and the room turned to her. The old keeper was looking at Verena with an expression that was half pity and half something almost like awe. You were found child, not born to any pack. No scent anyone could name. Do you know why? Because someone, long ago, hid it, wove it under. There is a craft for concealing a thread so completely that even the wolf who carries it cannot feel it, and it is the rarest craft there is, and only one line ever held it. She let the silence stretch. The moon wardens. The old bondkeepers? Before there were Ravenscar, before the great houses, it was said. The last of them were drowned out generations ago. Her stained hand gestured at Verena's frozen wrist. It seems the last of them was drowned only nearly, and set on the floodstones of the Fenlo, hidden even from herself, to grow up small and grateful and unnoticed. A thread like yours, Verena, a moon warden thread, bound to an Alpha King, deep as the two of you have made it. Sabine cannot make one. She can only take one, and a stolen bond like that would make her craft the strongest in living memory. Verena sat very still while her whole life rearranged itself around her. Not a mistake the world had loaned a life to. Not a mouth no one had chosen to feed. Hidden. Chosen to be hidden by someone who had loved her enough to give up the whole truth of her so that she might live to be unremarkable. And chosen again, at ruinous cost, by the man standing miserable and unmoving by the door. Chosen the first time in a fishing village, and chosen the second time in a hall full of people. So wrongly and so terribly, out of the same broken conviction that his love was a danger he had to spare her. Twice she had been chosen. She had simply been too busy being grateful for scraps to see that both times, the choosing had nearly killed her, because both of them, Torin and whoever had left her on the stones, had decided for her that the loving thing to do was to take something away. Her whole life, she had believed she was the one who was never picked, standing at the edge of every room, waiting to be allowed in, and it had been a lie. Not the kind of lie someone tells you. The kind you tell yourself so thoroughly that it becomes the floor you walk on. She had been picked and hidden and picked again and protected half to death, and she had spent 30 years reading all of it as evidence that she was worth nothing. She thought of the ring, cold in her palm, and the words she'd given him with it. Then it was never mine to keep. She had meant it as the truest thing she knew, and it had been the falsest, the old lie in its Sunday clothes. It had all been hers. She had, simply, never once, in her whole, small, careful life, dared to keep anything, because keeping meant believing she was allowed to, and she never had been sure she was allowed to breathe. "How do I stop the severing?" Verena said again. And this time it was not a question aimed at the room. It was aimed at Orla, and it was hard as flint. Not freeze it. Stop it. End it. I want the truth. Keep her all of it, even the part you don't want to say. Orla held her gaze. "A thread cut cleanly cannot be rejoined," the old woman said. "But a thread that has been made whole, sealed, completed, deepened past any gap for a blade to enter, cannot be cut cleanly at all. Sabine's craft unravels what is loose. It has no purchase on what is finished." She leaned forward. "The severing lives in the place where your bond lives. The grove you have both been walking in your sleep. The silverwood. That is where the thread runs, and that is where she is cutting it, and that is the only place it can be fought. If the two of you go there together, willingly, both of you, no more choosing for each other, no more noble absences, and finish what you began 3 years ago instead of letting it be unmade, then there will be nothing left for her to take." Orla sat back. "But hear the cost. To go in willingly is to stop hiding. The moment you make that bond whole, every thread weaver in Vilemore will feel a moon-warden bond blaze up like a beacon. You will never be small. Again, Sabine will come for it with everything she has, on the ground where it lives." Her eyes were kind and terrible. "I can freeze the blade a while longer. I can send you both to run, and hide you as best an old woman can, and you may even buy a few years. Or, you can walk into that grove tonight and stop being the girl the world was allowed to take pieces from, and fight for the one thing that was always truly yours." The fire cracked. The cold sat frozen at the edge of Verena's heart. She looked at Torin by the door, who had spent his whole reign believing the kindest thing he owned was his absence. And she stood and crossed the room to him, and took his hand, the first time she had touched him by her own choice since the hall, and turned it palm up, the way she had once turned it to give the ring back. "No more deciding for me," she said. "Come into the Silverwood. Choose me where I can see you do it." His fingers closed around hers. "To the end of it," he said. They lay down together on the narrow bed in Orla's warded house, in the last of the firelight, and for the first time in a fortnight, Verena did not have to be led, or ordered, or carried to Torin's side. She went to it. He drew her in against his chest, careful of the frozen blade at her heart, and she felt his breath stir her hair, and she felt the old keeper's voice, from the doorway, low and steady, guiding them down. "Don't reach for sleep," Orla murmured. "Reach for each other. The grove will open where the two of you meet." It did. Between one breath and the next, the firelight was gone, and the silverwood rose around them. But oh, it was dying now, far past the slow decay Verena had glimpsed before. The great silver tree, at the heart of the grove, stood black to its highest branches, its bark scorched to the color of the mark on her wrist, and frost sheeted the ground in every direction, and the warm green smell of moss and cold water had been replaced by ash. The columns of moonlight fell thin and gray through a canopy nearly bare. Somewhere, the spring had frozen mid-flow. It was the coldest place Verena had ever stood, and it was the inside of her own bond, and it was almost gone. But this time, she was not alone in it, and neither was he. "There," Torin breathed, and she followed his gaze to the base of the tree, where a single thread, silver once, ash now, ran up out of the frozen earth and into the blackened trunk, and along it, patient as always, the cold was climbing. The severing, made visible at last, here in the place where it lived. We finish it, Verena said. The bond. Here, where she can't reach to cut. That's what Orla said. A thread made whole gives her nothing loose to take. She turned to him, and the gray light caught the green of her eyes, and she made herself say the thing she had spent her whole, small, careful life never daring to say, but I won't have it done to me, Torin. Not even this. Not even the saving of my own life. I'm done being the thing that gets decided. So, I'm asking, do you choose this? Do you choose me not to spare me, not to protect me, not because it's the only door left, but because you want to keep me, and you're allowed to want that? His hands came up to frame her face, and there was no wall left in him at all. I chose you in a fishing village before I knew what it would cost, he said. I chose you in a hall full of people in the cruelest way I could find, because I was a coward who called it mercy. And I am choosing you now, here, where you can watch me do it, with nothing left to hide behind. His thumbs brushed the tears from her cheeks. I don't want to protect you from a distance for the rest of my life, Verena. I want to be close enough to be dangerous. I want to keep you. I'm allowed to want that. Say you'll let me. I'll let you, she whispered. And I choose you back, out loud, where everyone can hear. And she kissed him, there in the frozen heart of the dying grove. And the bond they had been letting the world unmake, thread by thread, they took back into their own two hands and made whole. It was not like the bonding had been 3 years ago. All instinct and hunger. It was a decision, made together, spoken, and meant. Two people who had spent their whole lives making themselves small and gone, choosing at the same moment to be seen and to stay. And where their choosing landed, the grove answered. Warmth bloomed up out of the frozen ground. The ashen thread at the base of the tree flushed silver from root to branch, bright and living. Frost hissed back off the bark. High above, bare black boughs shivered and put out leaves of new silver that caught the strengthening moonlight and threw it down in warm, bright columns, and the frozen spring cracked and ran, and the killing cold went out of the air. And in the center of Verena's chest, the blade that had been buried at the edge of her heart, shattered like ice under a hammer, and simply melted, gone, she gasped with the sudden warmth of it. The silver wood was alive again. Their bond blazed at its heart like a struck star. And of course, that was the moment Sabine came. She walked into the grove out of the thinning dark, and for the first time the elegant composure was gone from her face, because a moon-warden bond made whole is a beacon that can be seen from anywhere in the realm, and she had felt it blaze, and she had come to it starving. Behind her, dragged along by a gray thread knotted cruelly around her wrist, stumbled Odette, pale, exhausted, her river pearls tangled, looking about the impossible grove, with the wide eyes of someone who had not chosen to be there, any more than Verena had chosen the hall. No, Sabine said, and now her voice shook. No, you were meant to let it ripen, not seal it, you foolish children. You've put it beyond. She raised her hands, and the gray thread at Odette's wrist snapped taut, and Odette cried out, and Verena understood the last piece of it all at once. She's leashed you too, Verena said to Odette, her own granddaughter. You were never the bride. You were just the other hand she needed to hold the knife. I never wanted the hall, Odette gasped. I never wanted him. She said if I refused, she'd unravel my mother. Sabine wrenched the thread, and the girl's words broke into a sob. And something rose in Verena that had been sleeping her whole life under a craft laid over her on the floodstones of the Fenlo, something that knew, without being taught, exactly what she was looking at when she looked at the shining threads in Sabine Ravenscar's hands. Because concealment was the rarest craft of the old bond-keepers, the moon-warden craft, the weaving under of a thread so deep the wolf who bore it could not feel it, and the unmaking of a weave is only the concealing of it run backward. Verena had been hidden by that craft. It had lived in her hands her entire life, waiting, and now, in a grove blazing with her own made-whole bond, it woke. She did not reach for Sabine. She reached for the debt thread. The old gray knot that ran from Sabine's hand to the very root of Torin, the promise made to save 11 dying young, the leash that had let the old woman touch their bond in the first place. Verena took it between her fingers, and it was cold and ancient and knotted with a craft centuries deep, and she did what her drowned bloodline had always done best. She unwove it. Thread by thread, she took the dead apart, gentle and total, until there was nothing left in Sabine's grasp but frayed gray. Nothing. No claim, no purchase, no leash on the Alpha King of the Duskmere, or on the bond at the heart of the grove. And she reached across, and did the same for the cruel knot at Odette's wrist, and it fell away, and the girl dropped to her knees in the silver grass, free. Sabine Ravenscar stood in the blazing grove with empty hands, and for the first time in her long life, she looked exactly as old as she was. "You cannot," she whispered. "That craft is drowned." "The last of them is standing in front of you," Verena said. "You spent your whole life hunting a thread strong enough to make you unstoppable. You should have let mine alone. You woke it up." The silver wood, whole again and full of light, seemed to lean in around the old woman, and the gray went out of her, and she was gone. Not dead, Verena thought, only undone, her borrowed hold on the threads of the world unraveled all at once by the one craft that had ever outmatched her own. The grove fell quiet. The spring ran clear. Odette lifted her head, weeping and free. And Verena turned back to Torin, in the warm silver light of a bond that no one in all the world could cut now, and found she did not have to say anything at all. The curse did not lift all at once, because that is not how any of it works. The cold was gone from Verena's chest for good, and the mark on her wrist had healed to a bright, unbroken silver crescent that warmed whenever Torin was near, but the harder wounds, the old ones, took longer. Torin still woke, some night certain. He was a danger to everyone he loved, and reached for her in the dark, to be sure she was still there, and still breathing. Verena still caught herself some mornings, trying to earn her place, rising first, taking up no room, being useful before she let herself be wanted. 30 years of believing you are a life. The world was merely loaning, does not undo itself in one blazing night in a grove, but they were learning, that was the thing. They were learning it together, out loud, instead of each carrying it alone in the dark. When he tried to disappear for her sake, she called it by its name and made him stay. When she tried to make herself small, he told her, again and again, that she was allowed to take up the whole of her own life. Slowly, night by night, the reaching for each other got easier than the making of themselves. Gone. The court did not know what to do with a foundling Luna, who turned out to be the last of the drowned bond-keepers, and Verena found, to her own surprise, that she no longer much cared what the court knew what to do with. Odette Ravenscar went home to the eastern salt roads and, freed of her grandmother's threads, turned out to be a rather good and honest steward of them, and in time an unlikely friend. Bran took entirely too much credit for the whole affair. Orla said very little and smiled a great deal. And on an ordinary morning, months later, Verena woke slowly to pale light and the warmth of a man who was, at last, sleeping soundly through the dawn. No frost, no fog, no thread being drawn quietly towards some old woman's tower. She lay still and watched him breathe, and felt the silver crescent warm on her wrist, and understood that she was not being allowed to be here. She simply was here. It was hers. She had chosen it, out loud. She closed her eyes and let herself keep it.